everyone, welcome to another episode of Coast Connections. I'm Elizabeth Hines, and today we're bringing you a really intriguing story of one of the greatest adventures and escapes of the Second World War. You may have heard of the movie The Great Escape. Well, it's very much a Canadian story, although the movie didn't portray it that way. And it's not only a Canadian story, it's also a Nanaimo story. John Henry Colwell was one of the key players in The Great Escape in 1943, 44. We'll get to those in a minute. Today we have a historian from the Nanaimo Military Museum, Mr. Greg Devenish, and he's going to walk us through how he discovered John's role in The Great Escape. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for having me here.
Absolute pleasure to have you here.
Really looking forward to share this story about John.
Yes, a pleasure with the treasure that you brought along here.
Right.
Now, you are the director of the Nanaimo Military Museum since...
I'm one of the directors. Okay. I arrived in 2018 when I retired, and then about 2 years later I was put on as a director. I'm still a director, and one of my jobs is to look after the library. So, culling the library, keeping it in shape. We have about 3,000 books. Some of it primary resource, like John Caldwell's diary that we have in front of us here. It's a photocopy. The real one's in Comox, the Air Museum there. But we're just thrilled to have this because as an historian, getting primary material really adds to any kind of research. And it was used by Ted Barris in his book that you've got here, The Great Escape. He did talk about John in his book.
Yes.
So
John Colwell his diary is quoted quite a few times throughout Ted Barris's book.
And so is his prison record card that the Germans have with his fingerprint, his photograph, although he looks older there than he does in his first photographs in 41 that were taken in Manitoba. He looks older. I don't know whether that's the wear and tear of living in a prison camp, but nonetheless, we have a copy of it in his diary, and of course it sits in the book. So it was great to see that. And came across by accident because I was, as a librarian, we have a lot of stuff in the attic and we have a lot of logbooks by pilots. And I was going through this and I had read Ted Barris's book and thrilled with the book to find there is quite a Canadian connection. And we forget about that from the film.
Yes.
We'll talk about that later. However, what happened was I was going through the logbooks and found this. And I had read the book and I thought, is there a connection? And sure enough, there was. And this had to be a story to be told in our newsletter that we put out about 3 times a year. So that's how I came to write the story.
Now, John Colwell was actually born in India to parents who were medical missionaries there. That's right. And they came to Canada, to Nanaimo, when he was about 16 years old.
That's right. 1933, they moved here. And they lived down an extension. And they he started a chicken farm and they sold eggs. And during the Depression, I'm sure things were tough, right? And they were hardworking people. And then the war started. His dad, being a doctor, joined the military, looked after all of the inspections of the military installations on the island, also inspected a lot of them across the country. And it was in 1940 that John joined the RCAF. Couldn't have joined initially because he didn't have a degree, but that would change. In Britain you could, but Canada you needed so many of our people that wanted to join had to wait until they changed the rules to grade 12. So John joins in 1940 to become every young boy wanted to be a pilot. Yeah. And of course the heroes of Battle of Britain and Hurricanes, they all wanted to fly. But that wasn't for John. John wouldn't be a flyer. John would be a navigator and observer. That's what he was trained to do because he had an extremely powerful background in mathematics, geometry, and very impressed his people that were checking him out. Yeah. And
John went to train at the Commonwealth Air Training on the prairies here in Canada, where there was about 167,000 people that came to Canada from the Commonwealth countries to learn to fly, learn to be engineers, navigators. Right. And it was known as the Aerodrome of Democracy because we were training all of these pilots and air crew.
That's what Theodore Roosevelt called it.
That's exactly right.
The Aerodrome of Democracy.
Yeah.
And he trained in Regina, outside Regina, trained in Manitoba. And while training in Saskatchewan, he met his future bride, Fern Rogers, and they would keep this relationship up all that time while he was at war and then later in the camp. Yeah. So, but he graduated as a sergeant. When he finally got his license or qualifications, he was promoted to sergeant.
And he was about 23, I think, when that happened. Very young man.
That's very, and then overseas.
Yeah.
to an OTU squadron first to get some training for a month. And then he was put into 406 RCAF squadron. And initially a bomber squadron, but the Coastal Command seconded that squadron. And his first operations were over the Bay of Biscay, looking for submarines. I mean, as a navigator, you don't have GPS. You got to get the plane back and forth in bad weather, rough weather, and he's doing it.
All those calculations.
Yes.
And again, his math background. Yeah. The navigator is so key to the success of those bombing missions.
They saved down pilots. They did spot some submarines. And then it was in March of 43, the squadron then was put into RCF 6 Bomber Command, which was building up to 15 squadrons. Think about that. Country like us building up to 15 bomber squadrons.
And how many are in a squadron, Greg?
26 aircraft in a squadron. So think about the ground crew, the air crew, and 87% of those members were Canadian. So 406 then started doing bombing runs into Germany. And it's there while flying into Essen in April of 43. They do the bombing target. He's got to get it there. He's got to follow the crew and get them home. And unfortunately, of course, the RAF flew at night. The United States Army Air Force flew during the day. Coming back, they get knocked down by a night fighter, a German night fighter. And he ends up in Holland, parachutes out.
And that's the other thing. He parachuted out successfully, which is fairly rare. And he became a member of I think it's called the Caterpillar Club.
That's right.
For that, again, sort of miraculous landing. But he was in enemy territory now.
So he got that in prison, a letter. So the Caterpillar Club was given to anyone that used a parachute to survive. So George Bush, Senior, he got one in the Pacific. Chuck Yeager, first man, he has one. But they were allowed to put them on their uniform. Oh. Strange, eh? Commonwealth pilots weren't. American pilots could. So they hid them under their collars. So we have one at the museum. Oh. So it's kind of neat that he got that. But he didn't go out head first as he's supposed to. He went out feet first. But it worked. And he ended up in Holland. And he went to a family for food and shelter. They had told him that the rest of the crew had been found that survived. And he ended up giving himself up. And then he ended up way across Germany and Poland in Seguin, where he ended up at Stalag Luft III. So one wonders, what was that first day walking through that gate? You're looking at the north compound with 14 huts. You look behind you, you can see what was a hospital, probably pretty Spartan. You had the cooler or the prison behind you, some administrative buildings, a theater, and what was called a field, a playground, which not what our kids play on. It was pretty rough. Yeah. And you're looking around and you're now realizing, I'm here. Yeah. And this is home.
I'm not in Nanaimo anymore.
Not in Nanaimo anymore. Not in where the squadron was.
Separated.
What about my girl Fern?
Yeah.
How am I going to keep that going? Yeah. You've got 2 sets of barbed wire fences around the outside, guard towers, and then a tripwire inside that if you went over the tripwire, you could be shot. And pretty Spartan barracks that were raised off the ground. They weren't insulated. Windows and heat was very limited. So in the summer, if you were on the top bunk, you baked. If you're on the bottom bunk in the morning, in the winter, it was too cold. So pretty Spartan surroundings. And he learned very quickly who he had to trust and learned that food was everything. Food, calories was everything because they were limited by the Germans. And it got worse as the war went on. He keeps a record of that in his diary. He keeps the calorie count. And by March of 45, it's non-existent. It's almost nothing. It's down to like 700 calories a day. Brutal. You can't live on that.
Brutal. Yeah. So there's about, 8,000 men in this POW camp?
They got up before 40, they were up to 9,000. Originally, it was supposed to have that many.
Yeah.
4 huts, 14 huts with about 900 men, 100 men in each hut. He lists every person in his hut in the diary I showed you earlier.
Yes.
In fact, we have somebody from Chemainus, Tully.
Yes.
That's amazing. Who was there.
So many Canadians, the way he's listed them in there in the diary, from all provinces. I mean, there were so many Canadians in there.
Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia.
Yeah.
So there are about 90 names in there. So I'm assuming 90 times 14. But that would increase as the war went on and more air crew was shot down. That meant pushing them in. And there were different compounds to make up all of Stalag Luft III. Yeah. So they were a compound of about 900. There were like 10 compounds stacked one on top of the
Wow.
other. He was in the north compound.
Wow.
So
So they decide they're going to escape. So the escape committee was formed. There was about, what, 1,200 people who were on this escape group?
So before he arrived, he was unfamiliar with what was going on. And he's playing horseshoes with a friend of his. Do you know this story? Do you know this? Did you read this part?
I did,
He
yeah,
throws
go
the
ahead.
horseshoes,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden a couple of guys come over, POWs, pilots, and they're standing in the way. And this is rather rude. And he finds out there's actually sand coming out of their pants on their shoes and then scuffing it into the ground. Wonder what was this? And this is when he was introduced now to what was going on. They were digging 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry. And this is a way of dispersing the sand by carrying these socks inside your pants that you put your hands through your pockets, release the plugs, and it went down through the sand. So he became a penguin. That's what they call them, penguins.
Because you're walking around there, you're mixing it in, you know,
Right.
surreptitiously,
Right.
you know, nobody's noticing this.
Right.
And this is the sand, of course, from the tunnels that they're digging.
Tons, 80 tons, 100 tons.
And those tunnels were 30 feet down and
they-
about 2 feet square. These were small tunnels and very, very deep. So these guys were actually digging in the nude because they needed all the room they could get to tunnel through there, bring it up, get it dispersed, all this without being detected.
Right.
I mean,
So they built 3.
Yeah.
Remember, the barracks are raised.
Yes.
So the goons are always checking to see the height of the top of the floor to the bottom. Are they putting it there? They're putting in rafters, cigar boxes, behind walls, under the theater, under the stage, just anywhere where they could stuff it and release it. And then they found Tom.
Yeah.
And that
tunnel
really
named
set things back. They were going to get out 200 guys. 200 guys with documents, civilian clothes, rations, maps, compasses, wire cutters, all that had to be made. Every document. We'll talk about that later with the escape. And I mean, just to talk about resilient, talk about taking advantage of whatever you've got.
Yeah.
The one Canadian even grabbed 600 feet of electrical wiring, and he was able to, because they were using fat lamps, and they were able to put electrical wiring in there so they had lights off the system they could run in the tunnel to keep digging at night and during the day. I mean, really
during the
incredible.
winter.
And during the winter. They're doing the winter too. But the reason they went down 30 feet was the Germans or ferrets had sound detection, and they're checking. And the other thing they would do would be to take horse carts around, heavy weight, hoping to collapse the tunnel. So that's why 30 feet.
Wow.
This wasn't going down 5 feet. This is going down 30 feet to kind of a chamber. And then you're going to go out 320 feet to the woods, because there's all these woods around it. That was also like a wall, a psychological wall. I look out beyond the fence and I just see a curtain of forest. Well, the idea was to get that to the forest, and then the men could get up quickly. And they were going to go. So every document, incredible story. So John was involved with making quarter of those socks.
Yeah.
He made wire cutters. He made compasses. He took the milk cans that came with evaporated milk, put them together. He made a soldering device, helped that so they could put in air ducts all the way along the canal to pump air down. I mean, can you imagine what the air would be like at the face?
They'd
You got to pump
suffocate.
air down there.
Yeah, they had it all figured out.
Yeah. Plus, he also did a lot of things for inside. We talked about living there. Well, how do you have an impact? Well, you make a difference. So he's making stools, tables. He made a stove
We have a
out
picture of that
of
stove.
those cans, out of some clay. A picture.
Yeah.
He made the kettles. He even made a clock. I mean, this guy could do incredible things with his hands.
And he was an incredible artist. The sketches that he's done in this diary
Right.
are absolutely meticulous.
Right.
And I've never seen that, like actual person who was there in Stalag Luft III and his incredible drawings.
Yeah, you'll see it. Initially, the first drawings have 2 bunks, and by the time you see those black and white ones, we see 3 bunks. They're starting to squeeze them in. You see men playing checkers. You see men playing cards.
Yeah.
And it was could be a pretty boring life, right?
Yeah.
And there were 600 men involved in that escape to
And
get 200 out.
And 150 of them were Canadians, I believe.
But about 150
yeah.
out of the sort of the 900,
Yeah.
be about right. And the Canadians played a pretty important role, and we'll talk about that with the film to get that story right.
Totally.
But
So fast forward now to March 24th, 1944. This is the day, this is the night that they make the escape.
right.
So There was 220 that they had planned to get out that night.
right.
Tell us how many made it.
So
Great.
John was number one. So the agreement was the first bunch to go to the front of the line would be the high. So Bushel, he was X. He was an RAF officer. He was the head of X.
Yeah.
So he was number one. So they took some of the high-ranking guys. Then below that were people who could speak German. What of these, because they'd have the best chance of escape. And then you drew lots. And he drew 146.
Yeah.
And the idea was that during the night, you went from one hut to the other, your hut to 104, and you waited until you got called to go to the trap door. He was 146, he was with his buddy 147. And they waited and waited. And unfortunately, the tunnel wasn't far enough. And that must have been a horror show when they peeked up and found out, oh my gosh, we're not in the woods. We're about 20 feet short. So they set up a rope signal to someone in the forest, and then back into the tunnel.
Pull on the
so they could pull on the rope as a signal to move when the guards went to the end of the compounds. This really slowed it down.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine how anxious our friend John must have been. We've got to get out by now. And you could see the time going. It's now, they were breaking out at 10. It's now 11. It's now 12. There was an air raid that slowed things down because the lights went off. And some guys brought bags that were too big and they were knocking the sand down in the tunnel. And in the end, they only got 75 out. And it was on the 75th or 76th fellow got out before he should have, and a guard saw him. He was standing not a foot from and then all hell broke loose. And all of a sudden, John writes about that in his diary, and all of a sudden we wake up, goons are running in the hut. I'm burning all my documents. I'm throwing my food out the window, my chocolates, my raisins. I'm stripping off my clothes. And they were all taken. They closed down the tunnel, obviously. Now all heck is breaking loose as these other 75 were getting out of there. And in the meantime, the rest of the prisoners and all that compound were taken out in the wintertime, stripped of their clothing, made to stand there for about 3 hours while they did a check. And it's then they realized they were missing about 72 because they got some around there. And the Great Escape was on.
Yeah.
And now there was an order from the Hitler and the High Command, we've got to get those. And it's decided they're going to shoot 50.
Yeah. So they actually found 50 on the loose, on the run out there at different train stations, etc. Brought them back. And
well, they actually, what they did, I'm sorry, they in that escape attempt, and remember John didn't get out, as he says, maybe it saved my life.
Yeah.
They scattered throughout Germany.
Yeah.
Some were caught around Sagan. They tried to get to the railway station because they had tickets, train schedules. Train was the fastest way to get out. And you're either going to head to Holland, which is across Germany, or you're going to try to get north, maybe to get a boat to Sweden or down to Switzerland. But that was a long, long way. You're in Poland. And so they rounded them up slowly but surely. And as they rounded them up, the order had come down from Hitler to shoot them all. Keith Ogilvie, a Canadian pilot, he was to be shot. And it was Goring that talked him out of him. No, we just need, no. And they ended up just, as they rounded them up, interrogating by Gestapo, not by the police. This was new. Yeah. Gestapo's interrogating, not the police. And they shot 50 separately with the idea, and the word went out, they were shot, but while escaping, that was what they got. 17 were returned. Of that, few went to Colditz. Few went to a camp, and about 14 went back to Sagan, back to the camp.
And 3 actually made it. 2 Norwegian pilots and 1 Dutch pilot.
That's correct. And the Dutch pilot made it all the way to Gibraltar, and the other 2 made it to Sweden.
Wow.
Yeah, the Norwegians. And they could speak some German, so that helped in their escape. Yeah. It's an incredible story.
It's an incredible story, and so many roots right here in Canada. Right. So let's fast forward to 1963, where this is made into a movie.
Great movie.
Starring Steve McQueen and the epic motorcycle escape out of there, which was fictionalized.
That's right.
But they forgot the Canadians in that movie. There's only one name.
Only one Canadian in the scene where he gets in a fight with James Coburn, who's playing an Australian. And that's the only scene. And they show Americans, United States Army Air Force personnel in there. They weren't there.
No.
There were Americans there, but they were part of the RAF, RCAF. But they were there.
Yeah.
And they forgot about the Tunnel King was played by Charles Bronson.
Yeah.
No, he was a Canadian named Wally Floody, and I've done a story on him. Wally Floody was born in Chatham, Ontario. He worked, during the Depression, he worked different jobs, but he did work in the mines.
Yeah.
So this guy knew mines, and he was part of that top X. He's mentioned by Bushell quite a bit in the book about Bushell. That he and two other guys, one guy named Scruffy Weir from Toronto. There was another fellow named Burkhead. He would die. He'd be one of the 6 Canadians that were executed. They were the leaders in digging that tunnel. Pengali, I think it's Pengali is his name. He was the forger.
Yeah.
It wasn't Pleasance. He had served as a POW during the war, but he was the chief forger. So Canadians played a very important role in that organization at a high level.
And John Colwell was known as the Tin Man for
they
all
call
the
him,
things that he scrounged.
The guys around him called him the Tin Man because he could make anything.
And when I was researching this, the Germans did an inventory of the camp after the escape to find out how did they get all these resources. And among other things, they amassed 4,000 bed boards, 630 mattresses, 52 20-man tables. All this wood was used to shore up the tunnels.
That's right.
76 benches, 34 chairs, and the Tin Man had access to 2,300 spoons, knives, forks, 246 watering cans, and 400 of those clim cans that he made the stove out of.
And they also took blankets to line the rails in the tunnel to soften the sound, because they used buckets like little rail wheels on them to run the sand from the front to the back. I mean, they had a pump there with air. I mean, it's just amazing the talent these people
the ingenuity and the heroics and the brotherhood that was formed through this. Because it was about a year in planning, right?
Had to be.
Yeah.
It was well on its way before John got there. They had started.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty big task. And I think caught the Germans completely by, I mean, normally they get out in 1, 2s, and 3s.
Yeah.
I mean, you know the story about, in the movie, where we meet sort of Hiltz, that's Steve McQueen.
Right.
And he, on the first day, he's playing with a baseball, and he goes and he sees there's a blind spot between 2 guards.
Right.
No, that wasn't Hiltz. In fact, it was an RCAF guy who was an American from Arkansas named Nichols, who figured out pretty quickly there was a blind spot, and he did get out. And they caught him a couple of days later, but he did get out through that blind spot.
Wow.
So great stories, all
Very
these great
good
stories.
Yeah.
You know? In fact, I've got here, there were 3 guys that were pretty important. Barry Davidson was the scrounger, James Garner role. He was a Canadian. And it wasn't James Garner, the American, it was a Canadian who was a scrounger. So he's finding all kinds of wires, shovels. He's getting things set up where guys would fight. He'd take something out of a truck. And of course, he bribed a number of guards. You know, amazing.
It's amazing. And if viewers haven't seen the movie, The Great Escape, we encourage you to watch it.
Kids can watch it.
Kids can watch it, yeah.
Yes,
It's a family movie. In fact, it came out around Christmas time in 1963. Steve McQueen won Best Actor for that. And the film grossed about 11 million. And in 63, that's a lot of money. So John Colwell, Sergeant Colwell, didn't escape from Stalag Luft III, but he was frog marched out by the Germans. For several months, they marched them across.
Well, they started another title named George.
Yeah.
And he was involved with that. It didn't get far because by the time they were well into it, the Russians are coming, and now the Germans need to move them in March of 1945.
So these guys had to walk across Europe for 3-4 months.
All the way into south of Berlin. Yeah. So it's about 200 miles in. Wow. They didn't have winter clothing, very little food. They're sleeping in barns or on the ground. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them got frostbite. Yeah. This is a cold time of the year, pretty windswept, pretty flat there. Yeah. And so the conditions were pretty bad.
Brutal.
And he describes it in here, what that was like.
Yeah.
And they finally were freed. And then he came home. He picks up his girl-to-be, Fern, and they get married in Vancouver. And then they move back to the farm in Extension. He runs a dairy farm.
Yeah, he ran a dairy farm.
He becomes a real rock hound. He gets involved with scouts. He raises 2 children.
And he lived to be 101.
101.
Yeah, and died in 2007.
And his wife still was living. Wow. And she was almost his age as well. And then they started Janico, this incredible place in 1975 where he donated the land and the materials and built this building where people could come, recognizing when we get older, we move to smaller spaces, or we live in condos or apartments. You can't store your wood. You can't put your band saws and your table saws. All that was provided, and it's still going today after all this time. As a Rotarian, we've given money to this club where people can go, and whether it's quilt blankets, jewelry, polished rock, whatever you want, you can do there.
A place to come and do your craft.
And it's a social
space,
place.
And a social place.
What a legacy.
What a beautiful legacy.
What a legacy. I ran into a fellow when I presented this information about the museum in John at a recent Rotary meeting downtown. And one of the fellows came up to me, be my age, 72, and he said, well, my scout leader was John Colwell. And you couldn't meet a finer man. And he gave. And Tom Brokaw says that generation was probably the greatest generation that ever lived. Yeah. They were born in the 20s, lived through the Depression. Yeah. Their decision of graduation was about going to war. And when they came home, it was Little League, it was Rotary, it was Shriners, it was doing what John did with Scouts. Yeah. They gave back.
They gave back.
And an incredible generation, John lived it. Yeah. And he still has the legacy today.
And his original diary is in the Comox Air Museum.
That's correct.
And
it'll be worth going up to see that. And they actually have in that museum a cross section of how big the tunnel was. Oh, wow. So you can crawl through it. Oh. I can't. You got to be little to get through because it's only about as wide as yours. Wow. That's it. They have a little sort of demo there.
That's the ultimate immersive.
With a track. Yeah.
Ultimate immersive experience.
So good on Comox.
Good on Comox. And good on you, Greg Devenish, for making that discovery there and the correlation between Ted Barris's book and our own Sergeant John Colwell here from Nanaimo.
Well, there's lots of great books out. We talked about the Wooden Horse is worth watching if you like escapes. Colditz, McIntyre has a now book. Yep. Paul Brickell's book is always, that's where I learned, you know what? There weren't Americans in it and there weren't Canadians in it. So that's where I learned more about that.
It's amazing. We have to wrap here today. Okay. We have to make our own great escape.
I understand.
But thank you so much for sharing this story and bringing it out of the attic and into our lives.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed doing this.
Yeah, it's a privilege to meet you and to hear about John. It just makes me so proud as a Canadian and as a Nanaimoite.
Right. Come down to the VIM. Come down to the Vancouver Island Military Museum. Great place to come.
Thank you so much, Greg. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you. I hope this has piqued your interest in some of the World War II history and the Great Escape in particular, and Canada's role there, and all these fine young men and what they had to go through for our freedoms. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Coast Connections.